Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to Tabadlab 64th Policy Roundtable. My name is Samia Liaquat. I'm a director at Tabadlab. Today, we are discussing the gender digital strategy, inclusion strategy that the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority has recently released. It has done so with a set of stakeholders to highlight how we need to change digital inclusion to ensure women's participation. We know that women in Pakistan are 33% less likely to own a mobile phone and 38% less likely than men to use mobile internet. And some of the critical challenges that the report highlights to women are education and their limited sort of ability to utilize mobile phones, family disapproval. We have the cost of buying smartphones, safety and security concerns, and finally, a concern or a perception by a large majority of people that the internet is not relevant for women. Looking at these challenges, the PTA Gender Digital Inclusion Strategy has proposed a set of responses and an action plan, and these responses seem to have in mind ideas that have already been around for a number of years. And I think what this particular panel is going to be discussing is whether such ideas really need to be rethought, and the innovation and the new kinds of thought processes around how you structure such action plans and how do you take forward women's inclusion, especially women's digital inclusion, needs to be further unpacked. I have with me four absolutely brilliant professionals who are each, top of their fields, and I want to introduce them to you right now. We start with Kulsum Lakhani. Kulsum is the co-founder and general partner at I2I Ventures. In 2011, Kulsum was one of the most prominent figures in Pakistan's startup scene when she set up Invest to Innovate. And Invest to Innovate has helped hundreds of startups and a lot of female-led startups to develop in terms of accelerating their progress in becoming proper companies. In 2019, Kulsum founded I2I Ventures, which is a VC fund, and it is the first women's-led venture capital fund in Pakistan. So it really gives me great pleasure to welcome Kulsum to our panel. Our next panelist that I would like to introduce is Haris Mahmood Chaudhry. Haris is currently the COO of Mobilink Microfinance Bank and has over 20 years of experience in the banking and finance industry. Prior to joining Mobilink, Haris has been CEO of Universal Services Fund, and through that venture, he has enabled over 40 million individuals to access digital through a 70 billion rupee investment. Haris is deeply passionate about inclusion and diversity, and I really am happy that he is here with us and with me in the studio. Welcome, Haris.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Sadaf Abid, who is founder and CEO of Circle Women Association. Sadaf has huge experience in microfinance and in digital in financial inclusion of women. She served as CEO and COO of Kashf Foundation and has held an advisory role with the Dell Women Entrepreneurship Network, as well as chaired the Inclusive Development Committee while she was a member of the board of the National Bank of Pakistan. Sadaf has done a lot of leadership training and mentoring of women within Pakistan, and has, under her leadership, Circle was recognized as a Microsoft for startup, utilizing technology to address critical challenges. So I welcome Sadaf to our panel. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Halima Iqbal, who is CEO and co-founder of Uran. And I think many people have heard about Uran, which was set up in 2018 to make financial services simple, inclusive, and accessible for every Pakistani woman and her household. Halima has spent 10 years working in finance and in investment banking, and a lot of that time she has spent in North America. So Halima has really developed the idea of bringing what was something traditional, like women's committees, into the digital age, and we really look forward to her sort of reactions on the strategy and her proposed inputs. So welcome, Halima, and thank you for joining us today. So my first question, I will go back to you, Sadaf, is regarding the digital gender inclusion strategy that has been taken out by PTA. Looking at the strategy, do you feel it is comprehensive enough and actionable enough in terms of what it proposes to bridge the digital gender divide?
Yes. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for having me here, and it's great to be with friends and colleagues discussing a very important topic. So in terms of the framework that's been outlined, my first take would be that it's a good start. It's good to have something in place, but of course there are several questions and there are several ways that it can be strengthened. It is talking about certain targets. There are certain timelines that have been set. It is recognizing the digital gender divide in Pakistan, which happens to be the widest in the world, which is something we really need to address because we know that digital literacy, access to internet, is really in today's world a basic fundamental human right. And if we're not going to invest in it, if we're not going to bridge it, women and girls of our country are going to be left behind. And if 50% of the population is left behind, Pakistan is going to be left behind. So I think in that spirit, I feel it's a good start. However, I feel it can certainly be strengthened. And we know this that policy making is just one part of the process. It's really the execution and the people behind the execution which are going to be key. So, my recommendation would be, for example, we're talking about going to remote communities, we're going to disadvantaged areas. I would actually be a bit more controversial over here and say, let's not start with the most marginalized communities and the most difficult areas. I mean, it's already tough enough because we work as Circle in urban communities, and it's already tough. I mean, Jhang, Khanewal, Hyderabad, many of these areas, you still have many women who are not digitally literate, and their families don't want them to get on internet. The view of internet and digital tools is not positive. So my take would be, let's start with semi-urban communities, and in the next phase, go to the more difficult communities. Secondly, I would say in terms of the curriculum and the content that's going to be developed, it's very easy to say that we're going to roll this out, but who are the experts? How do we ensure it's tailored? The localization of that content, making sure it's women friendly, because different things connect with women. And we have to make sure that the language we use, all of that is customized. So I think that kind of finer detail I would like to see. I would also start early. One is the women that we need to catch up with, but then there are girls in schools and women in colleges and universities. And I think we need to go young, we need to start early. So, if we can make a system where we can actually bring digital literacy programs in schools and start early, I think that could be a fantastic start. And I think integration is a good idea, integrating it with SRs and other schemes. But again, it's not as simple and it will require much more thought. And I would also recommend some pilots and also agreeing on the definition of digital literacy. What is digital literacy? I mean, we need a common definition so we all agree on it and then we track it. I also don't see TikTok. Maybe I missed out on it, but I didn't really see how TikTok could actually be leveraged because that's where the masses are. So I think I'll stop over here and let
Yes.
others respond to.
Uh, Thank you so much, Sadaf. So, Kulsum, I want to actually bring you in over here because a lot of what Sadaf is talking about, digital literacy and what kind of content and looking at girls, I find that some of the challenges that have been outlined in the report or in the strategy shows that women are not in control, right? So even if we are preparing a lot of these solutions for women, will they have the opportunity to actually realize their potential by taking part in these solutions? how can we realign challenges and solutions in ways that can actually benefit women, but not really burden them to be the agents of their own change?
I think that's a really good point. And to disclaimer here also, I'm an investor in Halima's company, Oran. So I was joking with her before this that I would probably be pointing to a lot of solutions that these guys are building as an investor and also a board member in their company. I think, there is a lot of, labor, like emotional labor, and also just labor that women have to do in order to realize these own solutions. To your point of what you said, I think, to what Sadaf was saying, and just to how to think about this maybe a little bit differently, is maybe thinking about, like, number one, how do we put women more at the center of the design of the strategy and also the implementation of it, right? So not saying that women shouldn't be the agents of change, because I do think that women, when they are put in those positions, do often take on that power quite resolutely. And we've seen that in how Iran has been building their products as well. But oftentimes there are structural challenges for why they don't become those agents of change. So I think a lot of things is like really thinking about, like, how are we addressing some of those structural issues that are in place, and doing so by putting women at the center of that design. Like, how do you actually change that? The other thing that I would also say is that a lot of, and this is not to necessarily your question, Samia, but actually thinking a little bit about what Sadaf was addressing as well. I think a lot of the challenges sometimes with these strategies is they're very output related rather than outcome related. So rather than saying, and we've seen this with other digital strategies in the past, it's about graduating X number of people from boot camps, rather than actually saying, like, what is the outcome of people becoming digitally literate? What is the point of them having that digital access? Are they turning that into something? What does that equal? And so I think those types of things, I think, are really important in actually making sure that a strategy like this is actually implemented not only correctly, but there's actually an impact that goes beyond this a government that's in place right now. And I think that's always a challenge, is really thinking about long-term impact that goes beyond a regime, and actually something that can actually be taken on, in the next, whoever comes into power next, right? And so really thinking about institutionally, what are we putting in place right now?
So Halima, could I ask you to come in on this question as well? Because I'd really love to hear your perspective, because you've probably lived and experienced some of this exclusion in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on this panel. I'm super excited to be here. Couple of things that I think when we're talking about any kind of policy, the biggest problem with those policies become, the people making the policy, did they keep women in mind when pushing out for inclusion and designing those inclusion strategies? The second one is execution of those policies, right? And oftentimes we get what, as Kals was also saying, we focus too much on the output as opposed to what are we trying to achieve here. And in our experience, whenever you're trying to bring in a behavioral change, you have to think about it from a systematic, shared responsibility perspective, right? Like, you have to make sure that you are including the decision makers within their households as part of that change. And in large part, especially from a digital perspective, it is the man who's making those decisions, whether a woman should have a phone or not, or how that phone usage is happening within the household. But if you don't bring in that person who's making those changes within the household, you cannot all of a sudden expect that a behavior is going to change. So having that shared responsibility is extremely important, but also then thinking about it from a systematic change perspective and doing smaller things, and understanding that user journey and life of a customer, of behavior, how that can be empowered, whether it is through providing the right kind of education or providing the right kind of access. I think the last point that I want to bring in here is when we're devising these strategies and putting the onus on the woman to be that agent of change, we're also have to look at it from a holistic perspective, right? Like you have to think about it. Are there any contradictory policies that are existing that would hamper this change to happen or hamper this behavior to come into place, which a lot of times they are. Like I'll give you an example. When we talk about digital financial inclusion, one of the policies that had come out was every woman should have, to do digital onboarding, you need to have SIM under your own name. The reality is, even I don't have SIM under my name, right? Like in a household, a man would go buy that SIM, and you would have 5 or 4 SIMs under that name, and that just becomes your lifetime behavior. So if you bring in contradicting policies, you actually push people out, from a inclusion perspective. So I think that balance needs to exist, and it just comes down to how we're executing it on it, and how many women are involved in execution of it. How many people even understand the pains of these women, as to why actually they're excluded. So we don't do a lot of ground level work. We just sit in our conference rooms and devise these strategies when the realities might be very, very different, for a woman out there. And I think the last point that I want to bring on is what Sadaf also said. Instead of focusing too much on rural, let's focus on urban right now and solve those urban women problems, and let them be the champions of change, and let them create those network effects, rather than focusing on a problem that exists so deep and not necessarily understood properly. And when you keep on trying that, you keep on failing on that, and we've seen that from our history as well. So maybe a shift in focus on audience can help here, because a lot of us are those people, right? A lot of us understand those problems as well.
Interesting and slightly controversial, but I think we will definitely come back to that subject. But one of the things you said about inclusion in terms of execution of strategies, Haris, I want to bring you in here because I want to really understand what are the industry's perceptions around this strategy, and how do you think that they actually feel they can operationalize or implement some of the actions that have been put forward by PTA?
Okay. Thank you for having me over, and excited to talk about it, of a very important subject. It's a good start that the strategy has been out and this paper has been, put in place. But I think the execution, which my other panelists have talked about, I think it's also important that we continue reviewing this policy. So when we see that there is something that needs to be changed, so we can change that policy and we can improve it further. When it comes to industry, I think there are some other factor that also needs to be looked at. When we talk about the digital divide, it means that we need to bridge the digital gap through infrastructure. We also have to see how much the cost of digital infrastructure is going to be, and what is going to be the return for the industry on that. And currently, at this time of Pakistan, we've got the lowest ARPU in this region. And if we talk about the taxes, we've got the highest taxes in Pakistan. So that's why we see a lot of telecom operators are not heavily investing into improving the quality of mobile phone services and not taking them on to optic fiber, which is the true essence of connectivity. Secondly, also on the smartphones, we have to pay a lot of taxes, to get a smartphone, and this is not going to be an enabler for this policy. This is not going to help that we can bridge the gap, or having that digital inclusion, or heading more women into this inclusion space. So I think along with this policy, there needs to be certain labors which has to be in place. So this policy needs to be worked.
Okay, Haris. So when you talk about other policies that have to be in place, we're also looking at the way PTA is structuring its implementation. And it is really a whole of government approach where they're looking at bringing in different government departments and ministries to operationalize with other stakeholders some of their key methodologies for digital inclusion. But when we talk about I would say this whole of government approach, and Sadaf, I will circle back to you on this. when government itself is not being let's say, completely aligned with digital transformation, in its own systems and processes, how far can this kind of digital inclusion approach actually be led and managed by them?
It's a great question. And I guess we all know the answer, right? You've got to know what you're preaching. You've got to be in the trenches yourself. I mean, why was I able to do microfinance? Because I worked as a loan officer, I worked as a branch manager, then an area manager, then an operations manager, then the CEO. So I think unless we do what we want to spread and we know the nitty gritties, it's very hard. So I think adopting technology within the government, it should be going parallel and hand in hand, and we should be demonstrating the commitment towards that if we do it. And I have another fundamental question. One is about digitization and digital literacy for women, but the other thing is at a national level, even for women's inclusion, women's economic empowerment, we haven't made much progress as a country. So that's also actually very disappointing, because we're in 2024 and Pakistan ranks at the bottom on the Global Gender Gap Index in terms of women's economic empowerment, in terms of women's participation in the economy. We're at 21%. Bangladesh, our neighbor, is 40% plus. Vietnam is 70%. And these metrics are not changing. So I think, as my fellow panelists have said, we've got to build an ecosystem. We can't just tackle one problem in isolation. We have these interconnected problems. We've got to create safe spaces for women in public spaces and online spaces. We've got to provide affordable, accessible transport so for more women can step out into the economy. We have to invest in skills. We have to have women as role models. We have to have men as partners. So there are all these fundamental blocks that have to go in place, and then only, and I think we have to make this a national priority for our country, because no country in the world has progressed without women's economic participation. And let me share another thing. When we started doing work, because it's in the pandemic that I realized this digital gender divide. Frankly, I didn't even know we had the widest digital gender divide, and I was living in Pakistan. And the thing is, that's what got me started on what can I do for it. And we experimented. We worked with 60 women through UN Women Support. We didn't go out in the field. My team didn't go out. The women didn't go out. We gave them data bundles. We created videos. We created content. And it was so exciting. I mean, these women were great early adopters of technology. I still remember one woman coming to the hospital. Her husband was sick, but she didn't miss a single class. And she was like, I have this sense of community which was disrupted under the pandemic, and I'm feeling very inspired by my peers who are other women. So when we bring women together, when we get women to mentor each other, magic starts happening. So as has been pointed out, we don't know how we are capitalizing in this policy on women experts, on women role models, because otherwise it's just not going to work. So I think I have serious concerns in terms of our national priority in bringing women, in investing in women. I mean, IFC has calculated there's a 30% boost to our GDP if we bring women in the economy, but yet we're not making progress. So digital inclusion can, yes, be very hard.
So this, Haris, I want to come back to you on this, right? Because when we talk about who can lead this kind of a strategy, should it be government? We talked earlier when you came to the office, we talked about how the telcos maybe are not innovative enough or they are not really practicing kind of the innovation that is necessary to take us to the next step of sort of digitization, let's put it this way. So where do you think the leadership should lie?
I think it has to be a collective effort. It has to be done by the government and also with the private sector. So it has to be a public-private partnership because the policies are going to be formulated by the government and execution will be done by the private. And that's how it should be. And these are the example which has been set across the world where people have been successful or these policies have been successfully implemented. So it has to go hand in hand with the public and private sector. Your question about telcos not being very innovative. Again, I will refer to the same thing which I discussed earlier, because the government has not been able to enable them in terms of of their return. because telcos will only invest when they see the shareholders' value to that. And if I give you a simple example, right now there are three telcos operating in Pakistan. One is exited. Um, None of the telcos, other than the PTCL or the UFON, is being owned by the government of Pakistan. There's not a single business or a corporate that owns telco. If you look at other businesses like textile, energy, banks, insurance, everything is owned by the businessman. So obviously, the businessman also looks at the return on investment, and they see the return on investment is not very viable in the telco sector, and that's where the innovation and the investment does not come in. And the government really needs to think about it and needs to provide that kind of enablement by either by reducing taxes or by helping them out in in getting them, because the revenue is being earned in PKR and the license fees in USD. And you have seen the way the dollar to PKR parity has gone in the last 2-3 years. It's very difficult for them to survive in this kind of environment.
But if we look at, what is leadership, one of you has just kind of defined that it should be multi-stakeholder partnerships, business, public sector, policy making is a public sector initiative. Where does it actually lead us in terms of what improvements can come about within this current strategy? Who should be voicing, these kinds of the necessity for some changes in the way the strategy has been articulated? And I just want to also bring in the issue around data and the kind of data that has been utilized by the strategy. They've looked at, primary research, but in very small quantities and not specifically related in terms to asking women and men across the country what are some of the constraints and potential solutions. So if I come to you, Halima, and you've had experience with the women's committees and bringing them all on online platforms, what are some of the inputs that you think you would get from committee members in terms of looking at enhancing gender inclusion?
So when we look at bringing in women into the for more formal financial space, one of our largest challenge has been, how do you validate someone's identity, right? In a country like Pakistan, where women might not have the right kind of documentations, how do you still provide them and take a bet on them and say, okay, we're going to give you some access? So you start becoming a little bit more creative around it. But when we start looking at, okay, what are the alternative methodologies that we can go in and say, maybe if you're operating in a Pakistani market, how is a woman interacting with food delivery services? Can we get some form and shape of publicly available data on their behavior, but they might not necessarily be willing to share that, or they might not even have that disaggregated gender data, which starts becoming a really large problem. That if digital products in the market are not even collecting the right kind of information, then it just to build on that infrastructure and build different kinds of services becomes very, very tough. And I would also take a step back and say, okay, how many of us are even providing the right kind of economic opportunities for women, just from an employment perspective? And if you, things that Sadaf was pointing out, I have had experiences where I've faced discrimination because getting into a workforce after getting married might be looked down upon in a country like Pakistan. And that still today is actually true. We don't provide basic infrastructure for women to have economic opportunities by even building bathrooms for them in a workplace, right? Or even providing flexible work opportunities, because that's not necessarily considered economically viable. So when you're talking about, I think digital inclusion is a very far-fetched thought at this point when we have to solve for very grassroots level problems, when we start from basics and say, hey, how can all of us, private and public organizations, be mandated to have positions open for women and focus on that opportunity before we can even provide them with the right kind of financial tools to have a financial mobility. So those are the things that are missing from a infrastructure perspective. And we really need to look at it if we want that mobility to happen, both on digital inclusion, but also eventual financial mobility that you would be looking for, right? Like you want women to come into the economic become economic contributors, increase the GDP of the country. But if you don't provide them with the basics, then I think it's a very far-fetched thought that we will be going for a very inclusive environment, unless we get really creative, which I don't see that happening today.
So it seems to me that the panel kind of has a consensus around the fact that there are a lot of other policies which need to be put in place or which need to be implemented in order for us to move forward when it comes to digital gender inclusion. Kulsum, I want to ask you specifically on, one of the things that we've also discussed is this whole rural-urban divide and sort of maybe the low-hanging fruit that is in the urban areas to be able to cater to the challenges over there before we reach out to rural areas. But I know you and me have had conversations in the past about, even when it comes to the startup sector, about how do you actually kind of create opportunities in rural areas for men and women, boys and girls to really participate in the mainstream and to really actually contribute in terms of GDP and economic empowerment. Given we have a woman as our new minister for IT, what are your thoughts on how do you kind of bridge the divide between urban and rural and maybe some ways in which we could do that?
Yeah, and I think I stand on the controversial side of what Halima and Sadaf have been saying. I think, so first of all, yes, the IT minister, not only is she a woman, she's apparently very amazing, super smart in terms of her thought process and what she's doing. I think it's not just a low-hanging fruit when it comes to the urban side of things, right? It's the fact that from a digital perspective, yes, it is a low-hanging fruit because it's much more easy to address that population. There's also a reason why the startup space is so heavily focused on urban. It's because most of the founders that are in the startup space are based in the three major cities, actually. And so they're often building solutions for the problems that they're facing, which is really the best types of solutions to build. And you're building solutions for what you're feeling in your day-to-day life, which is in these urban centers. Can it be connected to these rural areas? Of course. So even as an example, we're investors in EdCasa, which is in the education technology space, which is leveraging technology to do a product that they call Connected Classrooms, which is using technology to connect educators and teachers to rural students, basically in schools that are not in great areas, but leveraging technology in that way, right? There is ways, we've worked in the agri space, we've invested in the agri space, they've now pivoted from that space, but really looking at working on the connective tissue in terms of supply chain of connecting farmers to retailers, right? And how do you actually use technology to actually make that process more efficient? We're investors in the trucking space, which obviously lends itself to the entire gambit of the country. And so I think you have to first say that, a lot of times you have to first name the fact that a lot of startups are addressing the problems that are in front of them. However, there is obviously that multiplier effect of how can they actually, as they expand and scale what they're doing, scale that to tier 2, tier 3 cities and kind of start to move into peri-urban areas a little bit in that way. I think the challenge that comes with our space, with the startup space as a whole, is that the funding that comes into it as a venture capital investor, we're looking for very high returns, right? And so oftentimes that comes from, investing in spaces that can grow quite fast. And so it isn't the low-hanging fruit, but urban areas do lend itself to that. So I do think that you can kind of game it a little little bit in terms of investing in companies, like I was mentioning at CASA, where there is that impact that goes beyond just cities. But I do think that there is a huge role that the public sector can play in terms of really thinking about how we empower not even startups, but people that could potentially be founders and entrepreneurs, obviously in the microfinance space as well. Sadaf has had a lot of experience there of really thinking about just entrepreneurs not just being at the startup level and that not being the only space that we invest our time and energy and effort into, but actually really thinking about it as a light of different types of entrepreneurs that can exist in different parts of the country and producing different types of businesses. So what are the types of financing that can exist for those types of businesses that may not be venture capital startup that exists in the tier 1 cities the way that we've seen? So I definitely think that it's a much bigger conversation. It's also very nuanced, right? You can't just have, I think oftentimes we attach success to venture capital style financing, and that's not the only type of financing that can or should exist, nor can it service the many types of entrepreneurs that come up in this country, especially the ones who are necessity entrepreneurs coming up in most of these rural areas. So I think it's, as we've mentioned before, it's a multi-pronged approach. To the point of what was said earlier, just a really quick comment that I want to make is, we keep talking about the fact that if we leave women out of the digital divide, that's leaving out, that's 50% of the GDP potentially that we can be doing that. But the issue that I often find is that I don't think everyone who are stakeholders recognize that that is a problem to begin with, right? Like if we're not even recognizing that the problem is a problem, how are we expecting those same stakeholders to be invested in the solution? And so what I often find is a very, very extreme parts of the spectrum is either you see male-only rooms deciding solutions for women, or you see women-only spaces, which doesn't allow men to be part of the solution as well. And I think we need to have, first of all, a recognition of the problem and really understanding and a real, really coming together and investment of the fact that this is a problem to begin with. And then as a result, really saying we need every type of stakeholder in those conversations, but in a nuanced way that allows us to address the different types of problems that you said, right? Which is rural, urban, within urban, there's so many different types of nuance that exists there. So sorry for the really long answer, but I think it's a very complicated question that we're trying to address.
No, and I think you've brought up a very important issue, which is about, consultation and who is informing decision making. Sadaf, I want to come back to you on this because from what I read in the strategy and in the report, I'm not sure that anyone at provincial level or at the district level had been consulted. And I wonder that if we go back to people, whether in the urban areas or in rural areas, sort of ask them for their opinion around what they would want out of digital connectivity, and especially what women would want. Do you think that we would be surprised?
Again, I'm thinking about your question because in some ways we all do know what are the challenges. Many of us who are working in this space see them every day. But at the same time, listening with curiosity and openness and bringing fresh ideas is really important. So I do think I am a believer of consultation and doing focus groups and going back to stakeholders. And okay, if this was not done before, maybe now is a time to actually do a series of consultations and hear the different voices, hear from young women, hear from young men, hear from elderly people. Let's bring everything together and hear about it. But I do think in terms of the barriers, we do have a grip on it. Like what is holding women back, what is holding women's digital inclusion back, financial inclusion back. I think we have a grip on some of these things, but how do we solve it? There is no magic wand. I can't, even though now I've been in this, trying to figure this out since 2018 through Circle, but I can't tell you there's one approach. But what I have learned is that there's a series of interventions that we have to do. It's not one-off training even. So if we're talking about digital literacy, it's not like we're going to do a X hours of digital literacy program and whoa, they're digitally literate. There's so many fears. There's that family, are they buying into it? So there's a lot of pieces that have to be figured out. So we have to experiment, we have to learn, we have to engage, we have to go back to the drawing room, we have to go back to the stakeholders. This is what we're listening, what can we do differently? So I think there's a lot of merit to using design thinking, using consultative processes to come up with things. Also, end of the day, I think there is some talk around that, in terms of using media and stakeholders. Like, I really believe we need to have amazing, powerful campaigns. And here I'd like to give credit to Jazz, because they came up with this wonderful campaign where it was like, they said, oh, a mother says to a daughter, oh, what will you do with a smartphone? And how does this help you? And how does that help you? And then the woman says, this helps me feel safe. I can navigate my route better. I can earn through it. I can connect to other women. So we do need to bring out these benefits, so that there is greater realization, because literally each time Circle goes into a new community, we have to engage with the mothers, we have to engage with the fathers, with the brothers, with the husbands, talking about the business case for women's access to internet and digital literacy. And the way I like to talk about is that, if a woman learns these skills, she becomes the pathway for the family, and she becomes the opportunity. And like when I used to go in communities during my kashf days, and I'd ask women, and even now when I ask women, what do you want, what's your wish, interestingly enough, they say, I want a salai machine, a sewing machine, because they still view that as their pathway for economic opportunity. But what I tell them now is, don't ask for a sewing machine. Ask for a smartphone. Ask for access to internet. Ask for a tech hub, because that is going to give you new skills, connections, knowledge, and earning opportunity. But the challenge in our country is we don't even have a base at the moment. I mean, there are women who have smartphones, and all they use it for, because they don't have exposure, is to watch the dramas. And the dramas, we all know what's happening on the dramas. I mean, there's negative stereotyping, and there are hardly any examples of women leading businesses, women using digital for empowerment. There are no great stories coming out. That narrative needs to change also.
Yeah, I mean, really, Sadaf, you've actually tapped into a number of the critical underlying issues. Haris, your time at Universal Services Fund, I mean, you were there to sort of reach out to the rural communities to increase digital connectivity. What do you think in terms of, how does one approach rural communities? How does one approach youth within those communities to bring them into this kind of the mainstream? Are there ways and means tried and tested? Does USF have any information on this?
Yeah, during my tenure, when we were doing different programs to bridge the digital divide, for different regions, it's going to be a different story. For example, if you go to Balochistan and we were doing the internet penetration for 4G over there, and we were, putting up the towers and fibers and telling people that we're going to do it. And when we used to tell about, that we want also women to start using this internet, people were a little reluctant. They were not very open about it. So we have to engage the elders of that village. And we try to tell them and take them into confidence that you can use this for positive things. So if there are women who are doing something from home, they can start doing it through internet, smartphone, and they could minus the middleman. So for example, if they're doing some artwork or some paintings or embroidery or something, they can start using. And then we signed up with Facebook, and their very famous program we started in Pakistan for the first time, in which they would train all these young girls and women how they can start launching their products through Facebook. And then if you go somewhere in I would say up north in Chitral, people were very progressive. People were very positive about this change, and we didn't have to do a lot of work over there. So I guess it depends from region to region and from area to area. But once people start actually using it for positive, they started making a lot of impact. And then we also started using those success stories and start sharing it with other regions and other areas. And that has also motivated them a lot. There was a very good example which was also picked up by the BBC. There was a young girl who used to live in Sakkar when the internet came in that, and she bought a smartphone. And what she did was she used to go to Karachi and she made an Instagram account, and she would get the local designer clothes from there and start selling it within the neighborhood through this Instagram account. And she started making money, and then eventually started building a small room for her, within the small vicinity of the house, and started, educating this to other people as well, and they started doing that. So the good use case example has also helped a lot. So I guess more success stories we have, and we can start talking about it, people will do get motivated. But there's no one size, one fit approach. So it has to be different approaches for the different areas.
No, I mean, I think context, context, context. That is really what it is about. When we look at framing the narrative, I think, Sadaf, what you did say, was very correct in terms of um, what are women doing on their smartphones? When we talk about women's economic empowerment, do people buy into that narrative? Or do they feel it's just a way for us to promote women's rights? I think there's a lot of unpacking to do in the kind of communications tools that we need to use, and the kinds of strategies that we need to sort of put forward. One of the things that Haris and I were discussing was that what happens when companies actually with their PR budgets are taking out fantastic campaigns, very interesting campaigns. But what happens when it doesn't have a gendered lens, or when it doesn't support women's economic inclusion or women's rights? Because that is where really, when I look at the younger population and I look at how they use social media, it's all about a narrative, building a narrative. And I think we need to maybe bring in more industries, more of the private sector to really change the narrative, because that could be where the innovation is. I still am hesitant about saying that there is a lot of innovation in government. I mean, I think government could lead the process, but maybe they need to bring in a variety of private sector actors. And so I want to kind of put back to all of you this question that, what do you think in terms of, if we were to go tomorrow to the Ministry of IT and Telecom and say to them, well, here's the strategy that you've been part of, but how do you really action it in a way that is going to get some minimum results within the next 12 to 24 months? What kind of inputs would you be able to give? What recommendations would you think would be the most useful, maybe the most practical? It could be really tiny things, but really practical, that the ministry can really find useful in terms of improving the strategy and then actioning it. So Halima, I'd like to start with you.
I think the first thing should be just looking at the policy frameworks that exist within Pakistan, and seeing if there's anything contradictory for this policy to actually get executed or not. The second thing would be running smaller pilots in urban centers to start off with, and maybe funding those pilots by just providing um, uh, internet devices into a household and doing those kinds of intervention to see what that impact would look like, and then going on a larger scale. And I think the third one would be bringing in public-private partnerships to do the right kind of executions and have the right kind of partners in place from an execution perspective. These would be the three things that I would recommend.
Haris, can I ask you, what do you think?
I think I would say that let's not regulate, please facilitate. And technology is, we evolve and we innovate. So there cannot be a certain fit policy or framework. Let the private sector work towards it, do it. They will do some experiments. Some experiments will be expensive, but the results will be much better.
But who would fund those experiments? And I really want to get to the nitty-gritty of, like, when you want to implement a strategy, there is going to be a whole financing aspect of it. So do you think the private sector is ready to put money towards that?
I think if we give the enabling environment, and then the private sector is willing to, because private sector has done a lot of investments. And now that if you look at a lot of people are investing in the technology, maybe not in Pakistan at this point in time, but we have seen a good growth. A lot of people in 2021 and 22 have invested in startups. So people have faith in Pakistan, especially with, the youth we have and the consumer business we have. So it's going to be there. But I think the private sector also has to take responsibility that all those funding comes in that goes in the right direction and should be put in the right place rather than doing certain experiment which has not worked out in the past.
Kulsum, in terms of, also in the involvement of the private sector, and what would your recommendations be?
Yeah, I think building off what Halima said, so to the point of what you made earlier, Samia, I think the data that we have there isn't a larger, we need a larger subset of understanding the nuance of this problem a little bit more. So I would actually first kind of do a more deeper study of, as much as we can, of like, what is the problem, and really ask the right questions, right? Not in a leading way, but being able to sit back and say, like, how are women and men viewing this potential divide, not potential divide, the current divide, and how are we building potential solutions to it? So I think the solutions will come off of actually understanding the landscape a little bit better. One thing that I would think about is that, we have had so many working groups in the past. Like, I think the government loves to set up working groups, right? And oftentimes those aren't extremely productive. I think you often see the same people within these spaces, but there have been examples of really practical, good working groups that have turned into policy changes. The State Bank, as an example, back in 2021, as a result of a working group of private stakeholders, basically implemented, the holding company legislation, which really opened up the startup space for funding, right? As an example. So I think you can have a working group that is actually very action oriented once they have data that they, that is action oriented, that can come together to have like very easy things that they can build off of. It doesn't have to be like something that is these enormous things. We don't have to address or answer the digital divide tomorrow, but being able to actually say, like, what can we do in like these like small fixes that can actually loosen, I guess, some of the challenges that we see. I think a working group that really is very practical and something that actually will lead to that change. We've seen that in the past as an example, really lead to that without being like siloed with many working groups, but just one. I think that to me would be one thing that I would really love to see.
Great. And finally, Sadaf, your thoughts, please.
So, one of my wishes is that every woman has access to internet and smartphone. And I really think that that can really change things. Because I think if we bundle that up with, like text messages going, which give them some digital literacy messages with video content. So there's a bundled service that comes through with it. And smartphones are available on installments, but on affordable installments. And I think the points mentioned by Haris on the taxes, all of those need to be addressed. I think that's really critical because without that, we can't really bring access to internet and digital literacy. And we have to have telcos as our allies, as our partners in this process. So I would really rally for that. Secondly, I would say that every responsible company does CSR, and I think we should really engage them on investing that CSR on digital inclusion. Because fundamentally, it's going to build a base for Pakistan. It's going to build a base for digital Pakistan. So I do think we need to nudge. Because if we leave this to goodwill, I'm not sure it's going to happen. So we need to nudge. We need to make the case that digital inclusion is a win-win for everyone. So get companies to put in their CSR funds towards this. I think run those pilots, as Halima spoke about it. Um, Come up with partners who have done things, who have shown results and outcomes, so that you try it out with them rather than spreading yourself thin. You work with those groups. And like Kulthum said, I also agree that I think there needs to be a working group, because I believe the working group should not just even look at the implementation of this strategy, but best practices globally. I mean, this is a topic of global attention, right? Even today in the world, we have 3 billion people who don't have access to internet. So this is not just a Pakistan issue, it's a global issue. And I think we can tap into global funds, we can tap into global networks, we can raise the profile of Pakistan as a country that's committed to bridging the digital gender divide. And we need more women in leadership roles to do this. And we need young women, we need youth, all of that. We need a very inclusive group of people who work on this.
Thank you. So what I gather from what everyone's saying is we need to build an ecosystem, right? So it's not just about digital gender inclusion strategy. It's about a lot of policies that can support and enhance women's access across a number of services and sectors. It's about bringing the right people on board. It's about having one working group, maybe not six, and being able to cut the silos. So I think some of these ideas, and then the whole piloting innovation and bringing the private sector in and saying, put the money here, let's see what we can do in terms of piloting these innovations, targeting young people, and trying to bring on board a variety of mindsets into understanding and acknowledging that maybe digital is the way forward, and the inclusion of women in the digital space is something that is a benefit for all. I want to thank all my panelists. I think it's been a wonderful session. I think this is just the start of a conversation. I do think that there is a lot more that we can talk about. Unfortunately, we are running out of time over here. But thank you very much, and look forward to having you all on another panel soon. Bye-bye.